we often forget that as adults, we have a lot more power than our kids. And so sometimes you might feel like I might feel like I'm just saying something like I'm not yelling at you, but because I'm an adult, I'm big, and I might be using more of a tone than I realize, it can come off as shaming to a child. So to think instead about, remember that this is a child, they're learning, and what do I want to do that's going to foster their learning instead of turning on their defensiveness? Because when you shame someone, our immediate instinct is to defend ourselves, whether we're an adult or a kid.
That is Rebekah Gienapp, and I am Catherine Alonso. Welcome to, or welcome back to, Change and You, a podcast all about how you make change for a kinder and more equitable world. And this season is focused on how we overcome obstacles to making change. And my conversation with Rebekah, we focus on two really important topics associated with that. One is how to adopt anti-racist parenting, how to be an anti-racist parent, how to teach anti-racism in your children at all different ages. And then we also talk about, what do you do in the face of injustice overwhelm? When you just get so overwhelmed by all of the things going on in the world, how much suffering there is, how insurmountable our challenges sometimes seem, and how we can move forward through that, and picking what your role is in it. And what I loved about my conversation with Rebekah is she gives us just so many tangible things that you can do. And I think it's just such an exemplary in terms of how we can make change in the world in alignment with what we care about and what we love to do. So I'm super excited to share this conversation with you. Before I do, I want to tell you how you can follow her work and connect with her, because I forgot to ask her that at the end of the interview. But you can connect with Rebekah by visiting her website, which is RebekahGienapp.com, spelled RebekahGienapp.com, so RebekahGienapp.com. You can also follow her on Instagram at Rebekah Gienapp. And on her website, she has a social justice superpower quiz, which is really designed for parents to figure out what their social justice superpower is, so that they can align their work against injustice with the things that they love the most. And she talks about the quiz and how you can use it in our interview, but I want to make sure to share those resources with you so that you can connect with her and her work, because it's really powerful stuff. So without any further ado, my conversation with Rebekah Gienapp. Rebekah Gienapp, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm really, really looking forward to this conversation. And so what I want to start off with is, tell me a little bit about what your work is and what you focus on.
Sure. I am an anti-racist parenting author and coach. So I do some about doing social justice work with children in general, but most of what I focus on is helping white parents and to a certain degree, educators figure out how to talk with white children about race and racism, and how to take age-appropriate family action to dismantle racism.
And how did you get to that? What was your journey to this point?
Okay, so it's a little complicated. I'll start off with what I think of as kind of a crisis point in my parenting. So around the time that my younger son was 4, I was driving him home from preschool, and we live in Memphis, which is a majority Black city. And so there's lots of African-American people. And as we were driving down the street, we drove past a restaurant parking lot, and he saw a man who was Black getting into his truck. And he said, "I wonder if that guy stole that truck." And my heart just sort of stopped, because I knew this was not an accident, that was who he said this about. He expressed a few things here and there, sort of feeling afraid when a Black man would be around, I'd noticed, but this just really hit home. And I thought, oh no, what have I done? I'm a person I had been a community organizer for 10 years in an organization that worked for economic justice, which overlapped very heavily with racial justice. I had grown up in Memphis, and because I'd gone to public school, I had a really racially diverse growing up experience. But because my son was in this private school, I realized that he kind of was in this white bubble and that he was starting to pick up racial prejudices from just the surroundings. Kids soak up so much more than we realize. And so I thought, I've got to figure out what to do about this. And it was also around the time of the 2016 presidential campaign and then Donald Trump's election. And I had stepped back from community organizing when my son was born because I was finding it overwhelming to try to do my best at my job and do my best as a mother. And I decided to step back and just focus on parenting for a while. But in 2016, I really felt the sense of I need to be doing something for social justice. I don't think it's going back to community organizing. I want to be able to talk to my child about what's happening and why it's wrong. And I think there are other parents out there who care about this too. I had already been blogging for a couple of years about diverse books and giving people book recommendations. And so that was kind of a natural bridge into how do we talk to children about social justice. But as I started delving into that more and thinking about my own family and then hearing from my readers, really the issue that was tripping them up the most was race and racism. And how to respond to that. So I kind of started experimenting in our own family, responding to the particular things going on with our younger child, and to a lesser extent, my stepson, who was in high school at the time. And then learning from other people and offering, workshops and blog posts and things like that for parents in my community. And eventually I ended up writing a book, Raising Anti-Racist Kids. It's structured in kind of an age by age way, because one of the gaps I was seeing is that there was some advice out there for, hey, parents, here's how you can talk about race with kids, but it was pretty general. And children change so much from the preschool years to being an older child to being a teenager that there's lots to think about how do we kind of scaffold that work with kids.
Yeah. And what in your work with parents, what have you discovered are their biggest challenges when it comes to raising anti-racist children?
So I think for white parents, one of the and white educators, one of the biggest challenges is most of us, even if we had parents who were well-intentioned, don't have role models who talk to us about race as kids. It was often a topic that was sort of avoided. There was a lot of the emphasis. I know I'm a younger Gen Xer. So when I was growing up, my family didn't believe this, but at school, I remember getting a lot of kind of it's important to be colorblind. We need to act like we're not different races and not seeing that can actually train us to ignore racism. So I think that's one challenge. And then another is oftentimes, families have 2, 3, 4 kids and their children may be in very different places, both because of their age, but also because of their personality. My younger son is a pretty anxious kid. And so I've found sometimes I've also done work in camp and religious education settings that there are things I can talk to other children who are the same age about that I need to be a little bit more nuanced and careful with him because he's so sensitive to violence and other things like that.
Yeah. And after that pivotal moment with your son in the car, what was your first step? Like, how did you get started in having those conversations with him?
Yeah. So I will say in the moment, I just completely panicked and I was like, no, he didn't. That's his truck. He didn't steal that. But I didn't even know how to say, like, I think you're assuming that because you see he's black and so I just kind of freaked out.
Yeah. Understandable.
Right. So just to say, I never judge other people. If you have, I like to tell my stories of my most incompetent moments to let people know that we've all been there. But some of what we started doing is I tried to start just talking about skin tone more and about race. I could tell one of the things he was picking up was he really didn't know what it meant to be white. And if anyone had any shade of brown skin, he referred to them as people with black skin. So trying to help him have different racial labels and talking about how we have peachy skin and people call that skin white. Reading more books. And over time, I also realized that part of, and this was maybe when he was more like 5 or 6 that I started to have this realization, but I realized almost everything we were reading that was a children's book that starred Black characters was about injustice. Mm. And so I was kind of giving him this, I didn't intend to, but this idea of the sole experience of being Black is about experiencing racism and injustice. So then I thought, oh, wow, okay, we need to work on this. So I started bringing in more fun, what I call everyday books, where kids are just having ordinary experiences with their families, or like the fantasy books. Now at 11, my kid is totally, all he wants to read is fantasy. So we read a lot of fantasy books by Black and Latino and Asian and Indigenous authors. But it took me a while before I realized that I needed to kind of mix up what I was doing and be more thoughtful about it. But having those conversations, and then when he would say something stereotypical, trying to really calmly unpack that, because there were some times where I didn't do it very calmly. He was a little defensive at first. And I found that being honest with him about some of my own missteps really helped. So there was another situation where we had a new neighbor that we hadn't met yet, and we were leaving for school, and he saw the guy walking his dog, and I think at this point he was like 7. So he said, "Oh, I think I saw that guy on TV. I think that guy's a criminal." And I said, "No, honey, that's our new neighbor. He's walking his dog. He's not a criminal." And since he was a little older and we talked more about race, I said, "I think maybe you're mixing him up with someone else you saw who was Black. And, that happens a lot." And he said, "No, Mom, that's not what I was doing." And I kind of just, kept driving. It's kind of a long drive to school. And then I said, "You know what? The other day at school, I messed up and I was so embarrassed. There's a teacher who always sits at the end of your hallway where your classroom is in the morning, just to make sure nobody needs anything, everybody knows where they're going. And I accidentally called her by this other Black teacher's name. And I felt so silly because the only thing they have in common is that they're Black and they're tall, but otherwise they don't look like each other." And I had to apologize, and I've been practicing in my mind. So I said, "So it's not that I was trying to mix them up, but it is something that happens. I think maybe that's what happened with you." And then he kind of relaxed, because he was like, "Oh man, Mom, you really messed up." And so we could have a little bit more of a less emotionally charged discussion about that.
Yeah. One of the things that story makes me think about, so I just finished reading a book about implicit bias and the various implicit bias tests that are available that you can, assess whether you have implicit bias. And my big takeaway from this book was that it isn't about not having implicit bias. It's about owning our own implicit bias and being aware of it and bringing it really from the subconscious into the conscious. And one of the limitations, I think, of the conversations around anti-racism in the last few years maybe is that it is easy to think that you are either racist or not racist. And there's a lot of shame in people being able to share their own missteps and recognize that it doesn't make you an inherently bad person to have made a mistake. And in fact, you're just so much more likely to be able to aid not only our individual progression, but our community progression, if you feel like you can say aloud, "Oh, I noticed that I had bias here and I acted on it."
Yeah, absolutely. And being able to say, "You know what, I realized I made a mistake," and apologizing to that person. But I would say not over apologizing, because if you kind of get in, I think that sense of shame does come up. That sense of, oh, I messed this up, which means I'm a bad person. So now I'm going to kind of repeatedly apologize or try to explain what I meant to say. And I didn't mean to say that. And that really takes the focus off the person that we've hurt. And so I tell people, apologize, ask if the person will be open to more conversation, either right now, or if they don't want to talk about it now, maybe later. But don't make yourself the focus. I think that's important for us as adults, and it's good modeling for kids as well.
Yeah. Well, and so much of it is the modeling, right? I mean, you talked about how I'm an older millennial. It certainly wasn't modeled for me and my family, like conversations around race. Absolutely not. And there's been a lack of that. And so for folks now with children, no matter what age, you're kind of figuring it out on your own, like how to model this well. And so what is your advice around how do you model a behavior when none of us are perfect all of the time?
Yeah. So I think one thing is just embracing a mindset of I'm learning and I'm going to continue to learn and I'm never going to get this perfect. That's why I often describe anti-racism as a journey, because it's not, we can't sort ourselves into categories. We can't say, well, I'm 95% anti-racist now, and so I'm good. Yeah. And it's really easy to also fall into this, finding the most blatant examples of racism and kind of, going on and on about how terrible those people are. It's really easy to communicate. Those are the racist. We don't need to worry about ourselves. Right. And I'm realizing I lost the thread of your question a little bit. Could you remind me?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. No, I think my question was, how do we model when none of us are perfect? Okay. Yeah.
I think one thing that, and this is a bigger step because relationships take time to build, but looking at our own circles and where we spend time, because as white people in most places in the United States, it's very easy to stay in mostly white spaces if that's what you choose to do. And so you have to be deliberate. Now, obviously, this does not mean going out and finding a person of color and trying to befriend them only because they're a person of color. That's very tokenizing. But instead looking, a friend of mine who also does this work said she had, she knew someone who was white and wanted to develop more cross-racial friendships. And so she wanted to take a Zumba class, and she decided, I know this one that's near my house and I could just take that, but no, I'm going to take it at this church where I know that a lot of the people signing up for it are Black. That provides us an opportunity to just kind of be in conversation and have a natural friendship develop. And I think we got to look for things like that for ourselves and for our children. Modeling, repairing and apologizing when we make mistakes, modeling respectful curiosity about other people's cultures. So, one of the things, and actually it just came up with my kid again today that I've been saying ever since he was young, is one of the ways that young children first often express racial prejudice is about foods they consider to be strange that are often from cultures that are not their own, and saying that's yucky or that's smelly. I mean, if you talk to children of immigrants, so often they'll have a traumatic story about bringing their lunch to school and someone saying that something they loved was gross. So since he's been very young, we've talked about we don't yuck other people's yums. If you see a food that you think is strange, first of all, remember some of the stuff that you like to eat, other people will find strange. There's no food that everybody likes. And that it's, it's not respectful and it's hurtful. So if you see something that you don't like, if it's being offered to you and you don't want to try it, you can just say, no, thank you. But we don't say something is weird or gross. And it came up today. He was kind of joking about something. And I was like, oh, we were learning about seaweed we homeschool now. And so we were doing a science lesson on seaweed. And we were talking about the different ways people eat it. And he was like, yuck. And I said, well, we don't yuck other people's yums. And he said, well, I was just kidding, Mom. It's like, well, we still don't.
Well, the most powerful lessons are the ones that are repeated, right? So
Right.
and it's a really good reminder. I'm going to use that. I really love that. We don't yuck other people's yums.
I think sometimes adults need to be reminded that too.
100%. As somebody that's British, you know how many people tell me British food is disgusting? Like all the time. And not that that's but it's not that it's comparable, but I do think that it's an adult behavior to kind of otherize often, whether it's food or culture or, people.
Yeah.
And so what's your vision for your work? Like, where would you love for it to go?
Well, one of the things I really enjoy is building community with people. So I have a anti-racist parenting course that started during COVID as Zoom only. And particularly this session in the summer of 2020 was so powerful because there were all these racial justice uprisings. Lots of parents were really wrestling. And so we had this group of I think there were about 15 people, and we got into really pretty deep discussions and built some real relationships. And I loved that. The challenge was once things started opening up again, it was harder to find times when people could get together virtually. So I ended up changing it to kind of a recorded course with some community elements. But this fall, actually, I'm going to try out doing the Zoom version again, as much because I learn so much and enjoy so much having those live conversations with people. And, I can have conversations I've been having conversations through Instagram direct messages about some videos I've been sharing, and that's helpful, but it's not quite the same as when you can see each other's faces, when you can take a decent chunk of time to really hear from each other about both what's going well and what you're struggling with. Yeah. And I would love to help people then be able to go out and facilitate those kinds of conversations and groups in their face-to-face, real life communities as well, because that's a whole other level of support that I've seen and that I think more of us really need.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think when we're having conversations about things that are scary and hard and overwhelming, having the safe space to be able to talk those through with people that you trust and they trust you, and you feel maybe a little bit more safe to make mistakes or to risk making mistakes, is such an important part of changing our behavior, changing our thought patterns, and influencing those with other people. So I would imagine that those live conversations, whether they're in Zoom or in person, are such a huge part of your work. Yeah.
Yeah. And just as we evolve as people, we need community, and we can learn things from reading books and listening to podcasts, but there's something about that back and forth conversation that is really transformative.
Yeah. Another thing I want to ask you is about the role of shame in your work or in how you coach parents to respond to a shame response, because I think that it is really common, when we do. I certainly have had this experience when I do something or say something that I know is wrong and was not intentional, and I sort of freak out, and it makes me feel very ashamed. And when I freak out, it does not enable me to be my best self or my best responder at all. And so I'm curious how you've learned to deal with that and how you coach others to do the same.
Yeah, I think one of the most important discoveries for me when I was early in this work, I developed a relationship with a mentor, Yardena Peacock, and she does a lot of, I came across her because she was doing kind of interfaith spiritual work for white anti-racist activists. And so it was a really interesting mix of people. I was there as this ordained United Methodist minister. There were people who were Jewish, who were agnostic, who were pagan, really interesting mix of people. But what she introduced me to was the practice of somatics, of really looking at where racism lives in our bodies and how our bodies respond, because so much of that shame response that makes it overwhelming is your heartbeat changes, your chest tightens, and it becomes hard to get clear thoughts because your brain's kind of getting flooded with all these stress messages. So through her, and then Resmaa Menakem, who is written a wonderful book called My Grandmother's Hands, that is about somatics and racial trauma, learning different practices. Some of them people might be familiar with from yoga and mindfulness, but specifically thinking about how do they apply to this context? How can we kind of slow down our body's response so that we don't cause more hurt when we're already feeling ashamed, or so that we don't shut down and then can't learn from it. And the other thing I talk to parents about is it's so easy for adults to shame children. We often forget that as adults, we have a lot more power than our kids. And so sometimes you might feel like I might feel like I'm just saying something like I'm not yelling at you, but because I'm an adult, I'm big, and I might be using more of a tone than I realize, it can come off as shaming to a child. So to think instead about, remember that this is a child, they're learning, and what do I want to do that's going to foster their learning instead of turning on their defensiveness? Because when you shame someone, our immediate instinct is to defend ourselves, whether we're an adult or a kid. So instead, to model some curiosity, even if that's hard to do. So if a young child, I think it's very common for young white children who haven't been around people of other races very much, they're maybe in the grocery store, and they see someone and they say, "Look, Mom, why is her skin so dark?" or something like that. And probably your immediate thought is to say, "Shh, don't do that. That's not nice." And instead, if the person has heard it, just say, "I'm sorry about that. We're gonna talk about that." But to talk calmly about, yes, we come in different skin colors, and you're curious because you have very light skin, you have skin we call white, instead of kind of shushing or shaming your child, because they have no idea why what they did was upsetting. So as part of modeling curiosity, I think finding a way to affirm something a child says. So in a situation like that, it can be, you're noticing that people come in so many beautiful, different beautiful shades of skin, because that lets children know, okay, even if you later talk about being more polite and not pointing or shouting things out, they know that it's not the topic of skin color that is shameful, because when we shush them, that's sort of what we can teach them. Or it's shameful to not be white is a indirect message that a child might absorb from that kind of, if you shame them for something like that. Right. So, or if it's hard to say something that, I notice, oh, good, I noticed that you're doing this. You can, I often recommend wondering. So if a child says something stereotypical, like I realized one day when my son was pretty young that someone had sung to him the Peter Pan movie song about Native Americans. It's very racist. I heard him singing it in the shower, and I thought, what? Because we have not watched that movie because of this song, among other things. And so saying something like, I'm wondering if you heard somebody else say that. Or if they ask a question, I'm wondering. Now, why is a little tricky with young kids because they don't usually know why they did things. But with an older kid, you might ask, I'm wondering why you're asking me that question. And both, it allows you to get some more information, and it gives you just a little more space to breathe. Yes. Remind yourself that this is your body's telling you this is an emergency, but actually it's a learning moment. It's not an emergency.
Right. And in a learning moment, if you yell at somebody, or our sharp responses in learning moments tend to shut down discussion, shut down opportunity for reflection. And then somebody freaks out because they feel bad. They don't want to think that they've done something wrong. And so the approach that you are suggesting really creates an opportunity for reflection and learning in a much more productive way.
Yeah, that's the hope.
Well, what I love about everything that you're sharing is it takes this very important and overwhelming topic of anti-racist parenting and turns it into a series of intentional steps, things that you can do, things that you can avoid, and really fosters a pattern of behavior that creates a different set of outcomes rather than putting us in racist or not racist columns, which isn't helpful.
Right. And I think growing up, I kind of fell into a lot of that thinking, partly because we had certain relatives on one side of the family who would say openly racist things.
Yeah.
And so, and the adult, we have sort of an avoidant family culture. And so that often was not addressed. It was just sort of like skirted around. And so I grew up definitely thinking that, there's sort of good white people and bad white people. There's racist white people and not racist white people. And it's not helpful because it kept me from kind of looking at myself and other white people who I feel like in general were trying to do the right thing. But we were causing harm that we weren't really of because we were so busy pointing the finger at the white people we had decided were the really bad racists.
Yeah, right. Well, and I feel like so many of us are people who are white and self-identify as liberal and have sort of told ourselves we're not racist and let ourselves off the hook and do not examine our own behaviors and opportunities in the way that we can and that we should. Yeah. Well, so transitioning a little bit, what led me to your work initially was I was really curious about this idea of how do we avoid, or not avoid, but how do we overcome the feeling of overwhelm in the face of injustice? The idea that there's just so many problems in the world. There's so much suffering. There are so many things to address that for those of us that are working intentionally on addressing those problems, it can sometimes get very, very overwhelming and fairly easily. And so I was researching this topic and stumbled across a blog that you had written really about how to tackle this thing. And the blog is entitled "When Injustice Overwhelms You." And so I'm curious to ask you, well, first of all, let me ask you this. What in your mind, how would you define injustice overwhelm?
I think it's when we're so flooded by everything that's wrong that we either get paralyzed and don't act, or we are acting but constantly feeling like it's not enough. And so we're beating ourselves up, which then you feel less like trying to do anything because you wonder if it's making any kind of difference. So I guess that's probably how I would describe what I've seen in other people and seen in myself.
And what led you to write the book? What was going on that led you to stumble into it? You were just as overwhelmed.
So at that point, we have been focusing more on anti-racist parenting for a few years, and I was dipping my toe into trying to do some activist things that I had done before I became a mom. And part of me was really enjoying that, but I was finding it difficult not to just like constantly raise my hand and say, oh, I can do that, or I'll show up at this. And then realizing that I was kind of plunging ahead too much. I was trying to imitate the life that I had before I was a mother, and where I was paid to be a community organizer. So a lot of times when I would show up at stuff, it was on my work time, so it was my job to be there. Yeah. Not that I didn't have any choice about it, but it was different. And so, I was thinking partly about, okay, what do I need to keep in mind? And also I was hearing, my readers really are a pretty big variety of people, but I would say there was definitely a pocket of them who had been activism had been a very large part of their lives, or some of them were still like doing community organizing, but maybe feeling kind of inadequate at it because they always felt like they were either neglecting their work or neglecting their kids. So yeah, I was thinking about what I would tell myself and what I would tell other people, other parents, especially who might be experiencing that.
Well, and in your blog, you go through 6 suggestions and how to respond to injustice overwhelm. And I want to actually go through all 6 because I just think that it was really phenomenal advice. So the first one is focus on one area. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how you address that for yourself?
Yeah. So I think picking the issue that you really care the most about and want to have an impact on is important. And so for me in the past few years, it has been anti-racism. And knowing what that is, because there are always going to be so many more things happening. I'm really concerned about climate change. Our world is literally on fire. But I've determined that right now I'm going to leave that area of activism to other folks. I do think that if we don't have a lot of time, it's even more important to focus on a particular area. And then something kind of more recent related to that, because the post you found is a few years old that I've thought more about, is not only to find that issue area, but to figure out what you are particularly good at or what your personality lends itself to, and then use that to get into that issue. So I actually just a few months ago developed what I call my social justice superpower quiz for parents on my website that they can take. And it'll kind of help you hone in on your personality traits and then give you ideas of how to use those doing social justice work with children. And so, yeah, because I think for a long time I thought just about the issue, but I've realized that I'm not the kind of person who particularly enjoys being in the spotlight. I like doing sort of behind the scenes stuff and thinking about strategy and thinking with kids, how do we, unpack this stuff? I don't want to be, I will sometimes go to like city council meetings, but I've realized I don't want to be the person to sign up to speak. I just don't. I used to do that, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to be there. I'm going to write my letters, but I'm not going to do that. So leaning into your strengths, I think also keeps whatever justice work you're able to do energizing instead of draining.
Mm-hmm. Oh my gosh, yes, you're absolutely speaking my language. And this is such a central part of the overall reason for this podcast, which is my experience has taught me that most people are driven to make a difference in the world in the time that they have here. And there are so many barriers to that. And one of the barriers is just not knowing how. And the answer that you're giving absolutely dovetails with that same question, which is figuring out what's the area that you care about, what's the area that you care about the most for now, and that you are going to try and move the needle within. And then how are you going to do that? And there's lots of different ways to make change in the world. It doesn't have to fit into the very narrow definition that tends to be most represented in our world, which is that of sort of traditional activism, which is associated with ideas of going to government meetings, protesting, walking in the streets, or being a politician, and there's many, 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 many other ways. So 1,000,000 times yes to that. So the second thing you said in your blog is find a community of people. Do not do this alone. And you talked already about one of your favorite things to do is to find community. For someone who might not as naturally find that something that's easy to do, what advice would you give them on how to find their people?
Yeah. So I think particularly if you are an introvert, which I am, and maybe you're living in a community that you haven't lived in that long, or you don't have a lot of ties, sometimes starting with online community can be the best place to dip your toes in, and look for that. So everything from, I know Facebook groups are not as popular as they used to be, but I have found them a helpful way to connect with other people on a variety of issues, or meetup groups, those kind of things. I know for anti-racism, there's an organization called Showing Up for Racial Justice that is particularly focused on helping white people plug into anti-racism, and they have chapters in various cities across the United States. And there's, lots of other groups like that. But I think just kind of experimenting. For me, my religious community was an important place to do that. But I know for others, that's not necessarily where they're looking for. But and even getting to know your neighbors, you might be surprised at I would say our next door neighbors on either side. We have lived here for about 10 years, and we have great political conversations. And sometimes I have literally gone with either neighbor side to particular things, or found out about local issues and events that I didn't know about
because of them. Yeah. Connecting to other people in your neighborhood is a great place to start. So the third one that you list in your article, which just really struck me, was to maintain a spiritual practice. So that one feels, if you're sort of skim reading an article, kind of, I wouldn't have guessed maybe that was a way to respond to injustice overwhelm. So tell me more about that and what you think that looks like.
Yeah. So I was really intentional in using the word spiritual and not religious. For me, my spiritual practices are closely related to my religious affiliation, but some people are very decidedly, spiritual, but not religious. It can also be things like, to me, mindfulness practices, or practices that help us connect to our body or to the earth. Those are spiritual practices. So I think the importance of that is it reminds us we're part of something greater than ourselves. And there's a lot of space and grace in that, and lessening the sense that you might have that it's all up to me. I mean, this kind of links into the community piece, but realizing that each of us is just one small part of this puzzle. And so we can take up the work that is ours to do and lay it down, knowing that there are other people. And I really think that spiritual practice helps us with that. I think it also helps in those times where things can just feel so discouraging, where maybe the issue you care about in your local community, maybe it's been years of working on something and it hasn't changed. Or I've been through experiences when I was community organizing where we won a very hard fought victory and at the local level, and then our state legislature did something to overturn it, a couple of years later. And so I think, again, those spiritual practices can help you get beyond the point if you're feeling like, I just can't keep doing this. It's too discouraging.
Oh my God. I mean, that's absolutely huge. It's such a huge part of any kind of social justice or social change work, is figuring out how to respond to backward slides, because they're guaranteed. Progress is absolutely not a straight line. And sometimes the setbacks are really, really big. So I really appreciate that. So the next advice is clear the clutter. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So, I'm trying to remember if Marie Kondo was like all the rage back when I wrote this or not, but I wasn't so much referring to physical clutter as like digital and mental clutter. So I'm one of these people that I will sign all the digital petitions, and then later I'll say why do I have 500 unread emails?
Yeah.
So, taking the time to unsubscribe from those things that, if you're not really doing them anyway, if you're not responding to the calls to action, it's just going to make you overwhelmed having it fill up your inbox. Yeah. So, taking the time to do that. And something that has not been quite as much an issue for me, but I'm often harping on my spouse about this, is get fewer news notifications. We do not need, we don't need nearly as much news as a lot of us are consuming. And there's a point at which information is power, and then there's a point at which information overload is very disempowering. So I think figuring out where your personal everybody has different levels of this, but what's your personal amount of news intake that helps you know what's going on without decreasing your capacity to act? I think is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the next one was one of my very favorites, which was know when to step up or when to step back. So tell me more about what you mean by that.
Yeah. So partly I was writing this in terms of what stage of life you might be in, what responsibilities you have. So if you are a parent of young children, or if you're taking care of an aging parent, or you're, in the final months of trying to finish your dissertation, there are limits on what you can do. But also I think for different personality types. So if you're the type of person who is very extroverted and you tend to kind of take charge, you may be doing that in too many places. You may be kind of diluting your effectiveness, or you might even be kind of taking away the opportunity for other people to have leadership if you're, taking on so many roles. And then for other people, if you keep thinking that you should take action and you haven't yet, or if you know yourself well enough that you realize that sometimes you underestimate what you can do, then push yourself to do something that's a little bit beyond your comfort zone. I'm not one of these people that's like, just go out and, try the wildest thing you can think of that scares you the most. That's not going to work. That's going to overwhelm you. You're going to bounce back. And so pick something that is a little bit, makes you a little nervous, but not overwhelmed, and try to do that. So that's what I meant in terms of like, maybe it's time for you to step up.
Well, the idea of step up or step back transitions really nicely into the last piece of advice you give, which is your life won't always be like this. And knowing that you were writing this piece kind of for yourself at the time, what did you have in mind?
Yeah. So there were so many things that I would get invited to that I would think, I really wish I could have been at that, or I should have been at that. And it was actually, I think, when I started talking to some people who I think of as kind of community activists whose children were either in high school or grown up, and they were so involved in things now. And they said, yeah, I couldn't do that when my kids were little. I had to step back for a while. Not that they didn't do anything, but that was not their main focus. And realizing that even just in the last few years, as my son has become a tween and gotten a little more independent, I'm able to do more things than I used to be able to. Whereas when I was young, I think I was a much more rigid thinker, and I sort of had this idea that like you set out on this path and then you are supposed to stick with it all the way. That's what it means to be committed, instead of realizing all the nuance that comes in life, and that we really have to go with the flow. And if I didn't understand that before, I mean, oh my goodness, like the pandemic just was like, weekly practice and pivoting and not knowing what to expect. So I feel like both my growing older and experiencing that has helped me a lot, with recognizing that life's constantly changing, and we have to figure out how to bend with it so that we don't break.
Well, and I think that exactly might be the theme that's run through this entire conversation, which is that life is constantly changing, and bringing it thought and intentionality to what you are doing, and also compassion for yourself, compassion for the people around you. And from bringing those things to the table, intentionality, thoughtfulness, and compassion, you're going to be best positioned to make the impact that you want to make.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rebekah, thank you so much for this incredible conversation, for your sharing your insights with us. I learned a ton. I know that everybody listening did as well. And I'm just really grateful to you and for your work. I'm super excited to see where it all goes. So thank you so much.
I enjoyed being in conversation with you.
Thank you so much to Rebekah. Thank you to you for being here. I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. I just thought that she gave us so many incredible takeaways and tangible things that we can do, not only when we face just so much overwhelm in the face of injustice, but also in how to be an anti-racist parent, no matter what that means to you, whether it's a child or whether it's maybe children in your family who aren't yours, nieces, nephews. I feel like these lessons of how we parent in the very general sense, how we lead and inspire other people are just so important and also apply in lots of different ways. So thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to seeing you back again next week.